For this video, we will be finding the answers for some function operations up here, f plus g of x, f minus g of x, f g of x, and f over g of x, and their domains. So here's f of x. F of x is the square root of x plus 8, and g of x is the square root of x plus 5 minus 3. The first thing we should do is find the domain for each of these functions individually. So I'm going to write it like this. The domain of f will be -8 to infinity. And you figure that out by taking what's on the inside, this x plus 8, what's known as the radicand, and you set it to be bigger than or equal to 0. And when you solve that for x, you get x is greater than or equal to -8, which translates into this interval notation. And so we need to do the same thing for g of x. So if you follow this same idea here, this x plus 5 is bigger than or equal to 0. That is, x has to be greater than or equal to -5. So the domain of g of x is -5 to infinity. That being said, now we can start adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing these two functions. So f plus g of x, I'm going to represent like this, f of x plus g of x. Remember, seeing these two functions added together is really adding the two functions together. That gives you the square root of x plus 8, all inside of the square root, plus the square root of x plus 5 minus 3, which is just the square root of x plus 8 plus the square root of x plus 5 minus 3, without the parentheses. Okay, so there's the addition for these two functions. The subtraction for these two functions is as follows. You'll set up the subtraction of f of x minus g of x. And this is really a negative one here that needs to be distributed to both terms. And when you do that, you'll get the final answer for the subtraction of the square root of x plus 8 minus the square root of x plus 5 plus 3. So I'm going to stop here with these two for right now. I want to talk about the domains of these two new functions. So when we started, we had this function over here, f of x, and this function over here, g of x. And we found the domain for each of these individually. The question is, which domain will we use for these two functions? Well, in order to answer that, I need to look at which domain is smaller, which domain contains fewer numbers. And if you look, -8 to infinity includes a whole lot of extra numbers that are not in the domain of -5 to infinity. So let's say you pick this domain. This domain would not be the domain of these two new functions, because in this domain, I can pick a number like -6. So if I pick -6 and I substitute it in for these x's here and here, what that means is I'll end up with a square root of -6 plus 8 minus the square root of -6 plus 5 plus 3. Now in the first square root, everything is fine. We have the square root. When you combine these two numbers together, we get a square root of 2. But in the second square root, when you combine these two numbers together, you end up with a square root of -1. And the square root of the negative 1 is not going to help us. We're looking for real numbers. This is imaginary. So that does not work. We cannot include numbers that are outside of this domain. So we pick the smaller domain to represent the domains of these two new functions. So here the domain will be -5 to infinity, and here the domain will be -5 to infinity. And I will give the examples of the multiplication and division on the next page. So on this slide, I will be finding the product of these two functions. These are the same functions that were given on the last slide. And again, when you have the square roots inside your functions, it does us no good to actually go through and perform the multiplication. So when we multiply these two things together, we will be left with the square root of x plus 8 times the square root of x plus 5 minus 3. And that's it. That is the multiplication of these two expressions, of these two functions. The domain here again, just like the first two, will be -5 to infinity. Again, because while -6 and -7 and -8 work in this square root, they do not work in this square root. So we need to pick numbers that are -5 or greater. And those numbers, -5 and greater, will work in both square roots. For this last example down here, this f of x over g of x, that will give you the square root of x plus 8 all over the square root of x plus 5 minus 3. And that's it. There's nothing to cancel. There's nothing to factor. That's it. We can't do anything with that. Now, the domain of this, we're going to start it at -5 to infinity. But that will not be the final domain. This domain comes from the square roots individually. But now, since there is a division happening, we also have to find a restricted value. So how you do that is you take the denominator, I'm going to do this in red, the square root of x plus 5 minus 3 cannot equal 0. So if you add 3 to both sides, you'll get this. If you square both sides, you will get the next step. And finally, if you subtract 5 from both sides, you will get the final restriction of x cannot equal 4. So now we have to combine these two ideas together. The domain has to be numbers that are bigger than or equal to -5, and x is not allowed to be 4. So how do we bring these two ideas together? The first thing we need to do is start with this old domain, right? We're starting at this domain. So what that means is we will be starting at -5, and as we travel to the right, we get really, really close to 4 as we approach it from the left. We get just to the left of 4, and we do not include it, but we snuggle up right on next to it. Then what happens is we skip over 4, and just to the right, we start at 4 and go to infinity. So this is how we bring these two ideas together. Numbers that are greater than or equal to -5, as long as that number is not 4. And we have to take this 4 out, because if you put 4 in for x, you get 4 plus 5 is 9. The square root of 9 is 3. 3 minus 3 gives you divide by 0, and we cannot have that. So this is the new domain for our new function.